Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture over the book of Daniel. Before we delve into the book of Daniel, there are four preliminary issues we need to mention. The first point is that there are two sections to this work. The first 6 chapters are composed of narratives about Daniel and his friends and their exploits in the courts of foreign, Gentile kings. As we'll see in a moment, the genre of these chapters is one that's very well known to the reader of biblical literature. Chapters 7 to 12, however, represent a vastly different genre, namely that of apocalyptic literature. Again, we'll explore the components and characteristics of that genre in a few minutes. Along with the difference in genre, we should also note that the book of Daniel is composite in another way, namely in language. That is, from chapter 2, verse 4b, to the end of chapter 7, the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. We're not exactly sure why we have these different languages present, especially since the Aramaic section includes material from both chapters 1 to 6 and 7 to 12. Finally, we need to understand the historical setting, or perhaps better, settings, of the book of Daniel, a period we call generally the post-exilic period, or more specifically, the Second Temple period. As you might imagine, the post-exilic period follows the exilic period, a period that we call the Babylonian exile, which lasted from around 587 to around 538. The post-exilic period, then, would begin in around 538. The Second Temple period, more properly, begins in around 515 with the construction of the Second Temple, and ends in 70 CE when the Romans destroy that Second Temple. The post-exilic period in Judaism is one of great turmoil and innovation. In a previous lecture, we discussed the siege of Jerusalem and the eventual destruction of the city and the temple by the Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar, whom we'll meet in the first 4 chapters of Daniel. After being released from exile in Babylon by Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire, most Jews decided to remain in Babylon. The ones who returned to Judea, or Yehud, found a virtual wasteland. After building the Second Temple in around 515 and adopting Torah as a kind of constitution in the late 5th century under the guidance of Ezra, an area of sectarianism began, with different groups interpreting Torah differently. These different groups allied themselves with different colonial powers, especially in the wake of the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. Following Alexander's death, his kingdom was divided up, and control over Judah eventually passed to a group called the Seleucids. One of the most ruthless Seleucid rulers, a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, would come to dominate the imagination of Jews during this period because of his actions toward the temple and his persecution of Jews. But more about that in a minute. To begin with, let's be more specific about the genre of the stories that we find in Daniel chapters 1 to 6. As John J. Collins notes in the second addition to his textbook, A Short Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, quote, "The stories in Daniel 1 to 6 have much in common with the short stories in the Hebrew Bible, especially those of Joseph and Esther. Like these stories, they are court tales, stories about Jews at the court of the foreign king. Unlike Esther, however, Daniel is overtly pious, and the stories are punctuated with prayer and praise. Nonetheless, they share with Esther the concern about maintaining Jewish identity in a foreign land in the service of a foreign king." Lawrence M. Wills expands on and clarifies Collins's description, writing in his monograph, The Jewish Novel in the Ancient World, quote, "The legends of Daniel 1 to 6 and other court narratives have been divided by scholars into contests and conflicts. In the contest, the protagonist, a member of the court, rises to prominence before the king by solving some problem or interpreting some sign or dream that none of the other courtiers can interpret. The conflict, which also concerns a courtier, provides more tension and drama. The protagonist in this narrative also begins within the court, but is persecuted or conspired against by the other courtiers, only to be finally vindicated before the king. While Wills's explanation of the literary characteristics of Daniel 1-6 is helpful in understanding how to engage those chapters as narrative, as story, we need to return to the work of Collins in order to understand the purpose and the intention of these chapters. Collins writes in a brief commentary on the book of Daniel, quote, "When we recognize the typical, rather folkloric aspect of these stories, we can see that they should not be read as historical accounts. They are stories intended to entertain and edify. They are, to be sure, serious stories which try to shape the way people live their lives, but the manner in which they achieve their effect is not dependent on credulity about the historicity of the stories. They require an attitude similar to that with which we approach any serious fiction. There must be a suspension of disbelief to allow us to engage in the narrative action, but we must also be aware that their truth is not literal, but symbolic." End quote. As such, we shouldn't take these stories as representing eyewitness accounts of historical reality. Rather, we should understand these stories as rhetorical messages written by Jews for other Jews in a post-exilic period. Now, time constraints prevent us from analyzing every single aspect of the stories in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, but it should be apparent from the chart I've provided on this slide that there are obvious and numerous shared features of the stories told in each chapter. In fact, it might be helpful for you at this point to pause the video and review the first 6 chapters of Daniel, paying special attention to the features and the commonalities that I've noted in this chart. Now, even though we don't have time to delve into every single story in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, the overall message of these chapters should be pretty clear. In his textbook titled Early Judaism, Frederick J. Murphy writes, quote, "Daniel 1-6 addresses issues faced by Jews subject to foreign rule. The value of Jewish wisdom, customs, and religion as compared with that of foreigners, God's sovereignty in the face of foreign domination, the necessity to observe Torah even when threatened with death, the importance of resisting idolatry, and so on." Collins supplements Murphy's assessment of the message of Daniel 1-6 by writing, quote, "When we look back on the tales in Daniel 1-6, we may be impressed with their general optimism. The stories reflect the determination of the Jews to live and prosper under Gentile rule, while maintaining uncompromising fidelity to their law. In fact, a major thesis of these stories is that success in the Gentile world is directly dependent on fidelity to the law. Daniel sees the rule of the Gentiles as part of a long-term divine plan. The 4 kingdoms have their appointed times. Their sovereignty is not absolute. Good Gentile kings will in some way acknowledge the God of heaven. The arrogant will be struck down. Ultimately, all 4 kingdoms will pass. What is crucial is that this entire development is subject to the power of God. Each kingdom is transient and can be disposed of by God as He wishes. Moving on to Daniel chapters 7-12, it's very important that we understand the genre of these chapters because it's a genre that the reader of the Bible has yet to encounter in full. Put differently, Daniel 7-12 is chronologically speaking the first full example of apocalyptic literature that one finds in the Old Testament library. Now, in another work on Daniel, Collins defines apocalyptic literature as follows, quote, "Apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality, which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. To piggyback on Collins's propositional definition of apocalyptic literature, in his text, Murphy provides what we might call a polythetic definition, in that instead of providing a dictionary-like definition, Murphy provides a list of 10 features that can be found in almost all apocalypses. Again, time constraints prevent us from delving into every single aspect of the book of Daniel, but I do want to focus on one particular chapter. There are certain features in chapter 7 that we need to call attention to. One of the most influential images that one finds in this chapter is the vision of the 4 beasts. Daniel narrates this vision of 4 beasts rising from the sea in succession, and biblical scholars commonly note that this vision and the beasts contained therein actually have both an historical and a political overtone. Put differently, the beasts represent 4 historical successive kingdoms with which Jews have had to contend. The first beast represents Babylon, the second beast represents the Medes, the third, Persia, and the fourth, Greece. Now, one of the reasons that this vision is so important should be obvious to any Christian biblical reader. The book of Revelation draws heavily upon this vision, and the book of Daniel in general, for both its form and content. Another aspect of Daniel's vision in chapter 7 that has captured the imagination of biblical readers is the depiction of the Ancient One, or more properly, an Ancient of Days, in verses 9 to 10. The reason this description has been so important is that previously, anthropomorphic descriptions of God have been avoided in biblical literature, obviously due to the aniconism engendered by the anti-idolatrous stance within Judaism mandated by the 10 Commandments. Here, however, Daniel describes the Ancient One in much greater detail than we have seen before, and this description is important not simply because one finds it filtering through New Testament and other early Christian literature, but also because this becomes the basis for the popular image and representation of God in the West. Another important image that one finds in Daniel's vision in chapter 7 is found in verses 13 to 14, where Daniel describes, quote, one like a human being, or more properly, quote, one like a son of man, who, quote, is coming with the clouds of heaven, end quote. This figure has, quote, dominion and glory and kingship, so that, quote, all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, end quote. In the socio-historical context of Daniel and his community, as in the history of Jewish interpretation of Daniel, this figure is normally taken to be the Archangel Michael. However, when early Jewish followers of Jesus read the book of Daniel in the aftermath of Jesus' execution, they saw in this Son of Man figure a prophetic foretelling of Jesus' identity. Thus, when the Gospels were written several decades after the execution of Jesus, we find the term Son of Man being used to describe Jesus. This process of the early followers of Jesus scouring and interpreting texts in order to understand their experience of him has been called messianic exegesis. The final image I want to discuss in chapter 7 is found in verse 20. That is, the quote-unquote little horn that we first heard about in verse 8. This little horn, quote, made war with the holy ones and was prevailing over them until the Ancient One came, end quote. Biblical scholars and historians understand this little horn to be a reference to a notorious figure in this historical period that I mentioned earlier, Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus is famous for not only raiding the temple, but also for destroying the altar therein and replacing it with an altar to Zeus upon which he sacrificed a pig. He also outlawed the study of Torah and prohibited the circumcision of Jewish babies. In the non-canonical book, 1st Maccabees, we're told the reason that Antiochus undertakes these measures is to try and ensure a greater homogeneity within his kingdom. In other words, Antiochus felt that if everyone acted the same and believed the same things, it would be easier for him to govern. What follows then is the first, but certainly not the last, instance of Jews being persecuted solely on the basis of their religious beliefs and practices. In this vision, Daniel is holding out hope for the holy ones in his community that Antiochus, as well as those like him, can be defeated. We know that hope needed to be fostered among Daniel's contemporaries because when we come to the end of the book of Daniel in chapter 12, we find the first unambiguous reference in the biblical library to resurrection. In chapter 12, verse 2, Daniel tells his audience that, quote, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." In the historical moment when Daniel's visions occur, the promise of resurrection to those undergoing religious maltreatment and oppression would have been an extraordinarily powerful incentive to continue resisting colonial and religious persecution. Continuing that train of thought, in his 1981 commentary on Daniel, Collins writes the following about the message of the second section of Daniel. Quote, "Throughout the book of Daniel, it is assumed that the God of Israel controls the destinies of all people. His dominion is not publicly evident. It is seen through special revelations by the wise, such as Daniel, and through exceptional acts of deliverance. This is the common ground which underlies the entire book. In the light of the crisis under Antiochus, however, this theology took on significantly new aspects. First, the Gentile kingdoms were no longer seen as potential servants of God. Instead, they were in revolt, like the little horn which raised itself against the stars. Or they were eruptions of chaos, like beasts from the sea. They cannot be reformed, only destroyed. Second, the reward in store for the wise and righteous is no longer success at the pagan court, or even earthly success at all. The ultimate reward is to shine like the stars in the afterlife. The visions, unlike the tales, provide an ideology of resistance. In conclusion, the book of Daniel is definitely a strange one, a book that is composite in genre, startling in imagery, but always hopeful in message. And with the book of Daniel, the reader of the Old Testament finds themselves at the very end of a chronological progression that began some 1,400 years earlier. Put differently, the material in the book of Daniel represents the very latest literature, chronologically speaking, that we find in the Old Testament. To be sure, there's a large mass of literature produced during this period which wasn't included in the biblical canon, but for those of you who are reading works found solely in the biblical canon, the book of Daniel is as far as you can go. I hope this mini lecture has been helpful, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.